Have you ever stopped to think how far a dog's courage goes when it comes to protecting the one he loves? Imagine the scene, one seemingly ordinary night, the silence of the street broken only by the distant sound of the wind, and suddenly an armed robber appears out of nowhere, ready to attack a defenseless woman. Now think of a dog, that everyday companion, turning into a real guardian in the face of real danger. It looks like a movie scene, but it's not. This story really happened in the United States, and to this day leaves everyone who listens to it breathless. What you will discover now may surprise you because we are talking about loyalty, instinct, and a courage that defies any human limit. When we talk about the power of animal protection, we often remember beautiful stories of dogs that accompany their owners on walks or that simply warm the house with their faithful presence. But have you ever wondered what happens when someone's life is at real risk? Have you ever wondered if your dog would do anything to protect you? It is precisely on this border between unconditional love and extreme danger that this impressive narrative is born. A dog, faced with an armed man, made the decision that would forever change the life of his owner, to face the aggressor head-on, even if it cost his own well-being. It is no exaggeration to say that this scene moves us because it touches on a deep point: the trust we place in these animals and the almost instinctual strength they demonstrate in moments of crisis. It's a call to reflect on what loyalty really means. And perhaps this is what makes this story so striking. It is not just a dog reacting on impulse, but an unbreakable bond built over time, which manifests itself precisely when danger knocks on the door. It stays with me until the end, because every detail reveals not only the bravery of this dog, but also how often heroes can have 4 legs and a heart, bigger than any fear. Visualize the tension building. The woman taken aback by the threat, unable to predict what was about to happen. The robber, confident in the advantage of the weapon in his hands, believing that fear would paralyze his victim. And then, like a fast-moving shadow, the dog enters the scene, breaking the cycle of terror that seemed about to consolidate. He does not hesitate, does not retreat, does not measure strength. Your only mission is to protect. And at that moment, the whole idea of danger changes sides. Those who should have control begin to face something they did not expect: the fury and courage of a determined animal. This is not just another narrative about violence or crime. It is a story of resistance, instinct, and love. It's about how, even injured, a dog was able to stop the attack and save its owner from a tragic fate. And the most striking thing is to realize that in the face of such a threatening thing as a weapon, the dog did not flinch. He moved on, guided by a force that needs no words, only action. Can you imagine the scene? The fear, the tension, the real danger, and at the center of it all, an animal that turns into a hero. And that is precisely where the greatest impact of this story lies. It is not fiction, it is not a film script. It's real life, with real people, and a dog that has shown that courage and loyalty have no limits. This introduction is just the beginning of a narrative that will move you, because every detail of this episode reveals something greater about the relationship between humans and animals, about how protection can be born from love and turn into heroism in the face of risk. And as you follow this journey, remember, what comes next will reveal even more about this defining moment, where courage and instinct came together to change the course of a night that could have ended in tragedy. And as you engage with this story, you may also feel that mixture of awe and chills just imagining the scene. It is at this point that I want to invite you to actively participate in this conversation. If this topic makes sense to you, leave here in the comments what has touched you the most so far. It may be the courage of the dog, the strength of the protective instinct, or even the way these stories remind us of the value of the bonds we create with our animals. I really want to know your vision, because each shared experience enriches this space even more. And since we're building this community together, your like is a powerful signal that this type of content deserves to keep coming to you. It strengthens the channel, helps spread inspirational messages, and even gives that push so that more people know stories that really excite. And of course, subscribe so you don't miss the next episodes. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this type of content, creating a network of people who value real stories of courage and loyalty. Now stick with me, because there is still so much more to reveal about this night that began with fear, but turned into an unforgettable example of heroism. Her name is Emily, a young woman who led a seemingly simple life, but full of meanings hidden in the small gestures of everyday life. He worked at a local company, spending hours between reports, meetings, and deadlines, but his real refuge was always at home, next to Max, a German shepherd who seemed to carry with him not only the imposing breed, but also a kind of silent wisdom. To many neighbors, Emily was just that polite, smiling girl who greeted everyone on hurried mornings, but to Max, she was the center of the whole universe, and, as a result, he also became part of the heart of everyone who lived around him. Max was known in the neighborhood. As a puppy, it attracted attention by its curious gaze and paws that were too large for its own body. He grew up fast, turning into a robust dog, but without losing the docile essence with those he knew. Emily remembered vividly the day she brought him home. It was a cold afternoon, fraught with uncertainty in her own life. She had just ended a difficult relationship, faced emotional issues and decisions that seemed overwhelming. Adopting Max was, in a way, a leap in the dark, a bet on the future. Little did she know that this little being would be the catalyst for a true transformation in her mindset and way of seeing the world. Over time, Emily realized that Max had something special. He was not just an obedient dog who learned commands, but a companion attentive to invisible details. If Emily came home more dejected, he did not run to play as usual. I just lay on the side as if to say, "I understand, I am here." If on the contrary she was excited, celebrating achievements, or simply in a good mood, Max responded with a vibrant energy, jumping, spinning, and transmitting enthusiasm. It was as if his soul was connected to hers, reflecting emotions, absorbing pain, and returning strength in the form of a presence. This connection was shaped by daily rituals. Every morning, Emily woke up early, and there was Max sitting next to the bed, waiting for the first gesture of the day. The noise of the kettle heating water, the aroma of fresh coffee, and the owner's footsteps through the kitchen were watched intently. He didn't have to ask for anything. He just accompanied, as if participating in this routine was his mission. When Emily closed the door to leave for work, Max followed her to the window and stood there, staring until she disappeared down the street. Those who passed by always saw the same scene, the attentive dog, like a guardian who only rested when the owner returned. In the evening, the ritual was completed with walks through the neighborhood. Emily took advantage of these moments to reflect on the events of the day, organize thoughts, and often find solutions to problems that seemed insoluble in the work environment. Max next to her was more than physical security. He was a silent mirror. His steady walk, ears raised, eyes attentive to every detail around, conveyed not only protection, but also a kind of serenity that helped Emily reconnect with herself. There, between rhythmic footsteps and the distant sound of the city, she found peace. Neighbors saw that scene almost every day. A woman and her dog, walking in perfect harmony. Many commented, "This dog seems to understand everything she feels," and it was true. All it took was a gesture, a subtle movement of the hand, and Max understood what he should do. That complicity transcended the barrier of ordinary training. It wasn't just obedience, it was bonding. But what few people knew was that behind that relationship there was a larger context. Emily lived in a region that, little by little, was beginning to register worrying signs of urban violence. Small assaults, break-ins, and reports of insecurity became increasingly common. Still, Emily never felt completely vulnerable. Max's presence transformed the atmosphere of the house. It was as if he were a constant beacon, reminding her that she was not alone, that she had someone by her side willing to face any approaching shadow. This confidence, however, was not blind. Emily knew the world could be cruel, but just having Max gave her courage. There were occasions when he proved impressively vigilant. Once, during a walk, an unknown man began to follow her for a few meters. Emily felt her heart race, but before fear could overpower her, Max abruptly turned around, fixing his gaze on the stranger. A low, steady growl broke the silence, and the man, surprised, immediately turned away. Emily understood, in that moment, that Max wasn't just company. It was her line of defense between vulnerability and courage, and this kind of situation was also shaping Emily's mindset. She, who previously considered herself fragile in the face of danger, began to perceive herself stronger, more resilient. Max not only turned her into someone confident on the streets, but also into someone confident inside herself. Decisions that once seemed burdensome were faced more firmly. Problems that once made her hesitate were now treated as challenges that could be overcome. The impact of that presence was profound, almost as if Max's heart was beating in sync with hers. Over the years, the relationship between the two has become almost legendary among acquaintances. Emily spoke of him as one who speaks of an inseparable partner. It wasn't just funny stories or cute moments. They were accounts of how Max helped her cope with painful memories, such as in the days when memories of family losses surfaced. In those moments, he just lay in silence, offering the warmth of his body as shelter. There was something revealing about it, as if to say, you don't have to face this alone. And so, day after day, routine after routine, the foundation of a story was being built that no one could predict the outcome of. Because we're not just talking about a woman and her dog. We are talking about a joint journey, marked by choices, by hidden truths that only appear when we look carefully, by small gestures that turn into invisible walls of protection. It is a relationship that goes beyond affection, and that inevitably leads us to reflect on what loyalty means, on how a bond can be so strong as to change the trajectory of an entire life. Now I want to go even deeper into this matter, because understanding who Emily was and Max's role in her life is essential for you to feel the real weight of what was about to happen. The seemingly ordinary daily life hid signs, harbingers, small revelations that, together, formed the silent preparation for a moment in which courage and instinct would be intertwined in an overwhelming way. He said, "Most of that makes sense to me." That night began with the same deceptive placidity as always, the street washed by a warm wind that swept away leaves and memories, as if the whole neighborhood was taking a deep breath after a long day. Emily pressed her step with Max beside her, the two in sync, each step echoing in the damp concrete. The lighted windows cut out rectangles of light on the sidewalk, and behind them, ordinary life went on with dishes being washed, children being put to sleep, quiet, late-night conversations. Everything seemed predictable, safe, almost automatic, and yet there was a subtle change in the air, an imperceptible shift that only those who are attentive to the backstage of everyday life can feel. Max felt it first. The muzzle lifted, the ears sought a sound that Emily did not yet perceive, and the tail, once loose, settled like a pointer that marks direction. 2 corners away, where the lighting from the street lamp failed and the shadow of a larger tree hid the quality of the faces, a man waited. He didn't live there, and the neighborhood didn't recognize him either. He carried on the floor a calculated haste, the mentality of one who rehearses cold decisions and evaluates variables as if assembling a puzzle in a hurry. Schedule, flow, blind spots, escape routes. Under his coat, the metal of the weapon rested against the fabric with a foreign weight, strange and at the same time too intimate with his intentions. Those who passed by without looking twice would see only one more body in the night. Those who really looked would feel the truth hidden in the rigid posture, in the gaze that does not wander, that points. Emily didn't suspect. He still reworked in thought, small scenes of work, micro-conflicts, solutions that only arise when the rush disappears. Max, however, had changed the tempo. The chest opened, the strides became elastic ready, and the gaze abandoned the horizon to examine the outlines of the shadows. It wasn't fear, it was reading. The dog, like an early reader, was turning invisible pages ahead of what human eyes could reach. There is no poetry when an instinct warns. There is transformation. The street that had been memory and routine moments ago now became a living map, a stage with precise markings. There an alley, there a low fence, further on a parked car that acted as a shield. The man calculated the instant of entry into the scene. He did not approach from the front, but from a tangent, like someone who asks permission to cross without attracting attention and suddenly takes the center of the picture. The fingers, hidden in the pockets, flexed, warming the joint for possible rapid movement. He didn't count on an audience. He wanted the meeting clean, brief, efficient. A nearly empty street, a stretch of failing lighting, a distracted woman. The plan seemed too good, and this is exactly why the tension rises. When everything lines up easy, life often charges with interest. The first warning came as a small noise, a step that scratched sand, a breath that did not belong in the flow of the night. Max stopped half a second. For Emily, it was just a stumble in pace, but inside the dog there was decision. He turned his neck and locked the sight. The growl that followed was not theatrical. It was technical, grave, restrained, calculated to cut through the air without fanfare and yet demarcate territory. Emily put her hand on his back, felt the hard muscle, as if an electric current ran through every fiber. Her mindset has also shifted. That good relaxation of a walk turned into vigilance, a change of camera that brings the frame closer, emphasizes details, ignites urgency. No one in the windows noticed. No one at the end of the street, passing by with headphones, noticed. The threat likes anonymity and small distractions. The man narrowed the distance, carefully measuring. As he walked, his coat opened an inch too wide, and the dull sheen of the metal drew a brief scratch in the gloom. It was enough for an icy certainty to touch the back of Emily's head. It wasn't possibility, it was presence. The heart hastened the beat, the whole body mapped exits. Max advanced half a step, positioning his shoulder in front of Emily's leg. A precise guard, not pulling over, not asking for anything but space. The street seemed to shrink. The sound of the surrounding world lost bass and treble, as if someone had turned a knob and isolated only what mattered. The man raised his chin in a short gesture, typical of those who try to impose authority without spending words. Behind that gesture were revelations about his own journey. Perhaps a history of attempts, perhaps a collection of nights when risk became habit. But the hidden truth of that moment wasn't in his past. It was in the decision about to happen. And decisions, when pushed to the edge, leave clear traces. Pupils that dilate, neck tendons that jump, the hand that weighs more on one side of the body to feel the weapon as promise. Max read each microchip as an experienced operator reads instruments on a panel. The air didn't just change temperature, it changed density. Emily noticed the detail belatedly, but the synchronicity between the two made up for the difference. She took no more steps back. She corrected her foot, firmed the shaft, released her arm from the inside. The backstage of a courage is born like this. No speech, no catchphrase, only adjustments that organize survival. The man saw this rearrangement and squinted for a split second, thinking about the impact of a large dog on the plane. The gun, still concealed, weighed more than on one side, reclaiming the scene. A door opened on the other block, scratching out a rectangle of light that was short-lived. The noise of dishes piling up, an old radio crackling, and silence returned as if who does not want to participate. It is in these hours that we understand why security is a fragile contract. It only takes one look with the wrong intention to break decades of habit. Emily shook her head, as if pushing away a hair, but it was a gesture to get a better look at the stranger's hands. Max, in turn, lowered his head millimeters and advanced the center of gravity, drawing the invisible line of, "From here you do not pass." There was no performing heroism there. There was technique, instinct, loyalty. The man then spoke quietly, something between order and threat. The words, more than the content, carried a cutting vibration. Emily tried to answer with a calmness she didn't feel, keeping her voice in a steady register. The tip of the jacket opened up again, and the shape of the weapon gained a definite outline. It was as if the world had signed an act. The danger was not a hypothesis. It was formally present. With this signature, the mindset of everyone involved went into high-risk mode. Max calculated distances, 2.5 steps to the attacker's leg, 3 to the hand that could pull the trigger, 4 to the corner where there would be cover. He didn't do the math, but the body did it for him, like a choreography trained by the species. It's funny how a few seconds can contain a lifetime. Emily thought about how her own personal transformation materialized around that corner. Years of emotional learning, small decisions that seemed irrelevant, all leading to the ability to be present in the face of violence. She was not a warrior. She was human, vulnerable, but sustained by a bond that anchored her. And Max wasn't a mythical character. He was a dog whose deepest truth is simple and absolute: to protect. The man, his finger impatiently brushing against the fabric, began to pull the weapon, confident in the superiority of an object that screams without asking. At that very moment, time dilated again. The city followed indifferent, and this indifference weighs. A car passed slowly. The driver did not even notice the tense geometry of the bodies on the sidewalk. The trees, tall, drew patterns on the ground, like grids of shadow. Emily heard her own blood in her ear, that buzzing sound we feel when the body prepares the escape and the confrontation at the same time. Max didn't look back, didn't seek confirmation. He stared. Inside him, the decision was already made long before the weapon began to appear. It was a line drawn years ago on each morning and on each return at dusk. There was no negotiation with this code. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because what is at stake, when danger actually approaches, is not only the clash between strength and vulnerability, but the clash between two systems of meaning. On the one hand, the cold logic of armed opportunism. On the other, the invisible pact of loyalty that is built in silence. When this shock happens, revelations emerge about who we are under the fright, what we prioritize, how we react, where we anchor our axis. Emily anchored herself on Max's back, in the warmth that radiated, in the exact weight that said, "I hold." The aggressor anchored to the metal on the promise of control, and the street, mute, turned court. It is in this court that the journey changes scale. With each breath, with each millimeter step, decisions cease to be theoretical and become pure survival. There is no background music. There is no beautiful cut. There is impact. What no one expected in that neighborhood, not diners, not TV and watchers, was that the common night had already become a frontier, and the next action, the next body tilt, the next choice would redraw the sense of security forever. He says, "I'm on this journey too." Max did not need words, nor clear signs, to understand that something was out of place. The air that night seemed heavier, charged with a dense, almost electric energy that only he could fully decipher. His instincts worked like silent gears, revealing hidden truths that the human eye was slow to grasp. Emily still tried to rationalize the presence of the stranger, believing that maybe it was just someone crossing the same path, but Max had already made his decision. The threat would not go unnoticed. It was at that moment that the first warning was manifested, and the transformation of the environment was felt almost palpably. The previously restrained growl became more audible, low, a sound that seemed to vibrate not only in the dog's chest, but also in Emily's heart. She was startled by the intensity of that reaction, but at the same time, she felt she couldn't ignore it. The hairs on Max's back bristled, creating a rigid line along her spine, and her entire body positioned itself in front, forming a physical barrier, a living shield between her and the oncoming man. It was not just a warning bark, it was a universal code, charged with purpose, as if it clearly said, "From here you do not advance." The impact of that moment was immediate. The silence of the street was broken by loud barking, which echoed against the walls of the houses and attracted curious glances through the half-open windows. A couple walking further on stopped for a few seconds, trying to understand what was happening, but followed the path in a hurry as if who prefers not to get involved. To anyone on the outside, it could look like just another dog reacting to a stranger. But for Emily, there was something different. She knew Max better than she knew herself. He could distinguish when he was only suspicious from when he was absolutely certain there was danger. And in that instant, there was no room for doubt. He was not reacting by chance. He was protecting. The transformation of the atmosphere was so rapid that Emily felt her body freeze. His heart raced, his breathing shortened, and his muscles, once relaxed by the pace of the walk, were now tense like ropes about to burst. His senses sharpened in seconds, as if every noise, every shadow, every detail of the environment had gained more intensity. Her gaze finally managed to focus on the male figure that kept approaching, revealing now not only a silhouette, but a hard countenance, marked by clear intentions. The contrast between the apparent calm of the scene, houses lit up, curtains moving in the breeze, the distant sound of a television on, and the latent tension of the situation left her paralyzed for a few moments. But Max's barking pulled her back to reality, reminding her that there was no room for distractions there. The attacker, annoyed by the dog's posture, tried to maintain confidence. His gaze was cold, but there was obvious annoyance. He took another step, revealing once and for all the metallic outline of the weapon under his jacket. Emily swallowed hard, and at that moment the feeling of vulnerability was overwhelming. Her stomach turned, her mouth went dry, and thoughts began to run over each other, creating risky scenarios in fractions of seconds. But Max did not back down. On the contrary, he advanced 2 steps firm with his teeth bared and his gaze fixed without blinking. His body language was clear. No matter the size of the threat, he was willing to face it. This was the first great shock for the man who had expected to find a defenseless victim and now saw before him a living barrier driven by instinct and loyalty. The barking increased in volume and intensity, reverberating around the block. It was as if every sound was an invisible blow, a declaration of war that could not be ignored. Emily could feel every vibration in her chest, as if Max's courage was seeping into her, pushing her against the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. There, in that instant, she began to understand the true impact of the bond she shared with her dog. It wasn't just companionship. It wasn't just affection. It was protection in its purest form, translated into every strained muscle, into every sound that echoed against the night. The mentality of the offender also changed at that time. What once seemed like a simple, almost guaranteed attack now required quick and calculated decisions. The presence of the dog introduced an unexpected variable, an obstacle that could not be easily dismissed. He knew that, faced with an animal of that size, any sudden movement could result in an immediate reaction, and this completely changed the backstage of the confrontation. The initial arrogance began to give way to a forced caution, revealing that the power of a weapon is not always enough in the face of the determination of a protect. The mentality of the offender also changed at that time. What once seemed like a simple, almost guaranteed attack now required quick and calculated decisions. The presence of the dog introduced an unexpected variable, an obstacle that could not be easily dismissed. He knew that faced with an animal of that size, any sudden movement could result in an immediate reaction, and this completely changed the backstage of the confrontation. The initial arrogance began to give way to a forced caution, revealing that the power of a weapon is not always enough in the face of the determination of a protector. Emily, still under the impact, noticed that Max's body trembled slightly, not from fear but from the restrained energy that was ready to explode. It was as if every fiber of him was on high alert, waiting just for the right moment to act. His body was lowered, primed, like a compressed spring ready to be released. The feeling was that of being in front of a force of nature, something that could not be stopped or controlled easily. She held the leash firmly, but deep down she knew that she had no real power over him at that moment. Emily, still under the impact, noticed that Max's body trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the restrained energy that was ready to explode. It was as if every fiber of him was on high alert, waiting just for the right moment to act. His body was lowered, primed, like a compressed spring ready to be released. The feeling was that of being in front of a force of nature, something that could not be stopped or controlled easily. She held the leash firmly, but deep down she knew that she had no real power over him at that moment. Max had taken over, and all she had left to do was trust. This first warning, with barking that broke the silence and a posture that imposed respect, was the watershed of the night. The street, once the scene of tranquility, was now the scene of increasing tension, where every second seemed to carry profound revelations about courage, instinct, and loyalty. Emily understood that what was happening went far beyond a simple animal reaction. It was the mat. Now I want to go even deeper into this matter, because to understand this moment is to plunge not only into Max's physical alertness, but also into the psychological impact that he caused on everyone involved. The offender had to recalculate his choices. Emily began to see life from a different perspective. And Max, guided only by love and instinct, showed that there are hidden truths that are revealed only in situations of extreme danger. That was just the beginning of that night's journey of transformation, where each next step would further reveal the intensity of the bond between human and animal, and the courage that comes when everything seems on the verge of collapse. He said, "That makes sense to me." The tension that was already cutting the air took shape when the man abandoned the mask of chance and, with a sudden gesture, claimed the scene as his own. The metallic sheen of the gun came out of the shelter of his jacket, not as a spectacle, but as a sentence. He was willing to go as far as it took to intimidate. Emily froze for a second that seemed like an eternity. What used to appear as distant rumor in news now had outline, smell, temperature. Fear before concept became matter. Only between her and this matter there was Max, and the first step of the offender was answered by a protective impulse that did not ask for permission. Max advanced with a dry bark without leftovers, those that make the whole night vibrate. It wasn't chaos, it was instinctive technique. The body protruded low, the hind legs propelling like springs, the head describing a precise arc to aim at the zone that overthrows balance, the supporting leg. The impact was immediate. The man tripped on his own shaft, the gun went up a span, and the hand that intended to impose control lost its choreography for an instant. Emily heard the clink of scraping metal in the makeshift holster and understood that every millimeter of hesitation could be worth the difference between life and death. The assailant responded with violence. The kick came fast, trying to rip Max off his leg. The dog locked its jaw and at the same time adjusted its body weight to avoid being thrown. A low growl cut through the air like an ancient warning that the human brain recognizes, even when the heart insists on denying it. From here, you do not pass. Emily, still in shock, felt the chain of the collar tighten on her fist. The reflex was to hold on, as if trying to control the uncontrollable and then let go because her body understood before her head. At that moment, Max was not just a dog, it was the switch between danger and her. The man regained half a step and tried to reattach the posture. The gun, now completely on display, swung at an intimidating angle. The street, silent accomplice, seemed to have diminished, shrunk to the point that the three of them occupied as much space as possible. The facades of the houses became walls of scenery. The pole cast shadows in strips that cut through the ground like railings. A window opened in the distance and closed quickly, the scene of a night he refuses to witness. It is in these hiatuses that time dilates, and decisions show who is boss in the chest. Max, without taking his eyes off the target, released his leg for a second to gain mobility and, in an elastic movement, repositioned himself between the gun and Emily. His body made clear lines in space as if drawing a border. Here is protection, there is threat. The attacker noticed this bodily intelligence and tried to accelerate, thinking that speed would ensure advantage. You missed the reading. When his hand went down for AM, Max jumped in a semicircle, shoulder to thigh bumping, again locking the enemy's axis. The gun deflected and scraped in the air, not lining up. The sound of metal hitting the very rings of the coat sounded too loud for a small street. Emily heard a command sprout from her throat without planning. "Max!" Not as a break, but as confirmation that she was there, conscious, present. The voice came out firmly, and Max administered that sound as information, not as a recoil order. The synergy of years of coexistence became an immediate solution. He maintained the pressure but adjusted the distance, forcing the aggressor to use his armed arm to balance himself instead of aiming. The man swore low, transferred weight back, and the toe of the sneaker scraped on the asphalt, throwing a strip of sand to the side. The friction produced the kind of noise that levels out reality. No one was in absolute control. Now I want to go even deeper into that because the confrontation, at that point, wasn't just about muscle and tooth and metal. It was about mentality. The aggressor arrived with the belief that fear would obey. His plan depended on it. Max came up with another grammar: protect without negotiating. In between, Emily went through a silent transformation. The initial fright gave way to a perception circulating throughout the body, that there was a kind of hidden truth emerging. When life tightens, it reveals what sustains who you are. There, her support was a bond, an ancient covenant, repeated without words every morning, on every return at dusk. This perception rearranged the focus. Instead of just looking at the gun, she began to look at the hands, the feet, the dislocation of the hip, the small decisions of the aggressor that betrayed intention before the movement. He tried another lunge, a sidestep to open an angle, the armed arm rising to expel Max with his forearm while seeking aim with his fist. The dog read the gesture at first, turned its head away from the line of blow and responded with a short sideways bite on the fabric of the coat that covered the thigh. It wasn't to rip, it was to correct course. The man lost his center of gravity, and when he recovered, he made the most humane mistake, dividing attention. One eye on the dog, the other on Emily. The gun swung and described an inaccurate arc that, for an instant, exposed the fist. Max saw it. The next turn was low, scraping the ground, accompanying the ankle wheel, and the whole body went up in lever to break the advance. Emily realized that breathing made a difference. It took a deep breath. The diaphragm descended. The vision cleared a degree. The sound of barking, which was once a single mass, separated into layers. The warning bark, the pressure growl, the straining breath. This new reading gave her a kind of presence that allows micro-choices. She retreated half a step, but did not give ground. She positioned herself near the wall, where the aggressor would have less space to surround her. She kept her hand free without trembling, not to face but to move without tripping over her own inertia. This is how courage is born behind the scenes, not with speech but with body architecture. The attacker felt the scene slip away and tried to appeal to the scream. The sentences came like blinding blades. "Stop that dog! Be quiet! Let go!" The language of fear demanded obedience, but it ran into the language of bond. Max replied with a unique bark, which is almost a signature. "I see you." Another effort by the man to shake his leg. Another adjustment by Max so as not to lose the base, and the sound of metal rubbing against the leather warned that the weapon, although present, was less and less functional. Gun without angle is noise. Uncontrolled noise is an invitation to error. The street kept its pact of discretion. A porch light came on and off. A distant engine crossed the main avenue. A dog in the distance returned the bark as if confirming that it understood the message. Emily felt a shiver creep up the back of her neck and down her shoulders, not of dread but of recognition. It was an awareness of the impact of that moment on his own journey. Nothing that happened there was just physical. It was as if life were putting on the table a set of revelations. What fear does to those it threatens, what loyalty does to those it protects, and what presence does to those it could paralyze. The man tried to improvise. He bent his knees, feigned a high kick, and on the way back tried to grab the leash to use Max as leverage against Emily. He found nothing but fugitive leather and opposing force. The dog turned its neck, released a bite into the air without catching only, to force the offender's arm to collect, and in that collection, stole the time. The weapon, which needed 2 seconds of alignment, gained only half. Half a second is defeat in confrontation. Unpredictability, which the assailant underestimated, now governed every micro-decision. Emily spoke again, low, like someone talking in the kitchen. "Calm down, Max." It wasn't a pullback request, it was a fine-tuning. Max subsided a tone of growl, not readiness. This adjustment brought a curious effect. The man, expecting a gap, accelerated a step, thinking that the dog would give way. And it was in this reckless step that Max reaped the error. He projected his chest forward, hit his shoulder blade on the thigh, and the offender gave way 2 spans back, hitting his heel on the uneven edge of the asphalt. The fright opened a sigh that was enough to overexpose the wrist. The gun pointed nowhere. The fist strained too much, lost finesse. None of it was cinematic, it was raw, direct, the opposite of glamour. It was about decisions, about the mentality that chooses where to put the weight of the body, where to aim the gaze, what word to use or not to use, and also about the hidden truth of a relationship that, from being so trained in routine, becomes anti-fragile in chaos. A routine of walks, windows, breakfast, stays, and together, all leading to coordinated responses when violence decides to test boundaries. That is why, in that elastic minute, Emily did not collapse. There was structure, there was axis, there was Max. The assailant, in a last gesture of one who wants to regain territory, raised his arm again as if to push the world. The shoulder stiffened, betraying anticipation. Max set off in the same fraction of time, not to the hand, but to the forearm, breaking the movement from the base. The shock wasn't pretty, it was efficient. The gun, forced upwards, drew a useless arc. The man let out a gush of anger that came along with a broader imbalance, the kind that invites falling if there is one more wrong push. He hasn't fallen, yet, but his center was no longer his. And this is where the scene takes on a new prominence in Emily's mind. She feels like she has passed a portal. The initial fear no longer determines everything. Her body is less on the run and more in presence. The street doesn't just look like a threat, it looks like a map. And Max, who has always been home, is now also strategy. This consciousness does not end anything. It inaugurates. The night didn't get any easier. It got sharper. And when things are clear, we see what needs to be done and what needs to be avoided. There is danger, yes, but there is also a line built for two, which does not break with the first push in the world. The confrontation had not yet decided the winner, and perhaps this is the point that weighs the most. The moment when everything can tip to either side. The aggressor, panting, tries to recover the dignity of the gesture. Max, wet with canine sweat and rapid breathing, does not give an inch. Emily, heart loud as a silent siren, anchors the gaze and holds her own trembling as one who holds a door in the wind. Between one bark and another, the night holds its breath. The next movement will be more than physical. It will be the continuity of a logic that each one has chosen for himself. And the street, which promises nothing, remains as a speechless witness, keeping track of every step. He says, "I'm on this journey too." The confrontation that already seemed unbearably tense took a leap to an even more brutal level when the aggressor, overwhelmed by despair and anger at losing control, decided to react with more violence. He couldn't stand the thought of being challenged, even more so by a dog that wouldn't back down at his gun. It was then that, in a quick gesture, he raised his free arm and struck Max hard, trying to push him away at any cost. The impact was direct against the body of the dog, which let out a growl of pain but surprisingly did not leave the position. Emily felt her heart break into 1,000 pieces when she heard that sound. It was as if her soul had been struck together. Max staggered for a split second, but instead of retreating, he planted his paws on the ground and launched another attack. The protective instinct was stronger than the pain, and his determination seemed impenetrable. The offender, realizing that only brute force would not be enough, tried to kick the animal violently. This time, the blow hit Max squarely in the ribs, eliciting a high-pitched bark that echoed like a blade cutting through the silence of the street. Emily put her hands to her mouth, stifling the scream that wanted to escape. The sight of that blow made her whole body tremble, and for an instant she felt the dread of losing her companion. But Max did not give up. Even wounded, even with his body denouncing the impact, he returned to position himself in front of Emily. His eyes shone not with fear, but with a courage that defied logic itself. It was the materialization of something that cannot be explained with words alone. The decision to protect at any cost, even when the risk is life itself. Every growl, every bark, every movement was a silent cry of loyalty, a reminder that true loyalty knows no bounds. The aggressor began to lose patience. The pain caused by the bites, added to the discomfort of facing an animal that did not surrender, made him act even more erratically. He raised the weapon, trying to use it not only as a threat, but as an object of attack. Emily felt her stomach turn at the sight of the gesture. It was not only the possibility of being shot, but also of seeing Max being fatally shot. Her heart begged for a way out, but the scene spiraled darker and darker, as if the night was about to collapse on them. Max, however, did not back down. The man's next blow grazed him on the head, drawing blood near his ear. Emily almost knelt down in despair as she saw the dark stain run down her companion's fur. But what left her in shock was realizing that instead of indulging in pain, Max lifted his body even higher, moving forward with the same force as before. It was as if the wound was fuel for even greater determination. His courage became a painful spectacle to watch because it showed the raw truth. Heroes bleed too, but they don't back down. The attacker no longer hid his despair. With each attempt to push the dog away, the situation got further out of his control. Emily could see the anger stamped in his eyes, but also a growing fear, as if he had finally understood that he faced not just an animal, but an unbreakable bond. The armed arm trembled, unable to keep its aim steady, and this revealed the psychological burden Max was imposing. There in that corner forgotten by night, a battle far greater than physical was unfolding. It was the clash between the instinct of destruction and the instinct of protection, between fear and loyalty. Emily felt her legs weaken, but at the same time something inside her strengthened. To see Max resisting, even wounded, awakened in her a courage she had never known. With every blow received, with every reaction of the dog, she understood that love can turn into invisible armor. It was impossible not to weep as she watched that sacrifice, but the tears were not only of pain, they were also of recognition, of reverence for the companion who was willing to stand between her and death. The man once again attempted a kick, this time with even more violence. The sound of the impact reverberated around the block, and Emily shouted Max's name in despair. The dog fell for an instant, gasping, but in a matter of seconds got back up. His eyes were fixed on the offender, and there was a flame in them that could not be extinguished by blows or wounds. It was as if Max said without words, "You will not pass." That moment became a watershed. The aggressor, who until then believed that he was the master of the situation, began to realize that there was no easy victory. Max, even injured, stood his ground, and that changed the whole dynamic of the scene. Emily, once paralyzed by fear, now felt the impulse to react, to actively participate in that struggle for survival. The impact of that moment was so intense that she knew, even if that night ended in tragedy, Nothing would erase the revelation that lay before her eyes. Now I want to go even deeper into this matter, because the danger that intensifies not only shows the brutality of the aggressor, but also the silent transformation of Emily, the revelation of the mentality of a dog willing to sacrifice itself, and the psychological impact that this generates on everyone involved. It is a cruel and yet inspiring reminder that true courage is not the absence of pain, but the decision to keep going even when every blow seems unbearable. He says, "I'm on this journey too." Max was already wounded. The blood was discreetly staining the fur near his ear, and his every breath was accompanied by a noticeable effort, but none of this made him back down. On the contrary, it was as if the pain had turned into fuel, into something that further intensified the determination to remain between Emily and the abuser. He moved with the agility of a warrior on the battlefield, attentive to every gesture, to every slightest change of posture that might indicate the next attacking move. The man, now seized by the mixture of hatred and frustration, sought to advance more violently, but each attempt was barred by that loyal body, which threw itself without hesitation against the threat. Max's bites were fast, accurate, always aiming at strategic points. First, the attacker's leg to destabilize him, then the hand holding the gun, trying to wrest any advantage he had. Each time the man tried to pull the trigger or raise his arm, Max appeared as a living shadow, scratching, biting, preventing the plan from coming to fruition. Emily watched in amazement, her heart pounding so hard it felt like she was in the fight herself. The feeling was that at any moment the situation could get out of control irreversibly. The street became a field of tension. The sound of barking, mixed with screams of pain and anger, echoed like a warning to everyone around, but no one dared to approach. It was as if the houses watched in silence, mute accomplices of an unequal duel. Emily felt the scene in two layers. On the one hand, the absolute fear of losing Max or being hit. On the other, a kind of reverence for his courage, a courage so raw and real that it revealed how loyalty can cross any boundary. The assailant tried to move forward with more violence. He gave Emily a shove, trying to get her out of the way, but Max reacted immediately, throwing himself against the threatening arm. The impact was so strong that the man staggered, almost knocking over the gun. It was at this moment that Emily realized how much control of the situation was really in the hands, or rather in the fangs, of Max. Even wounded, even at a clear disadvantage, he was able to stop the criminal's advance, delaying each attempted attack. The dog's every start was a mixture of desperation and strategy, as if he knew he couldn't afford a single mistake. And yet the tension remained. A shot could happen at any moment, a miscalculated reaction could be fatal. Emily lived in suspension, caught between the desire to run and the need to stand firm, unable to abandon the companion who fought for her. It was a journey of seconds that felt like hours, in which each breath carried the weight of a decision. The psychological backstage of this confrontation was even more intense than the physical. The man, increasingly out of control, could not understand how a dog could resist so much, how it could defy the logic of a gun at the ready. Frustration turned to anger, and anger to carelessness. Max, by contrast, seemed clearer in his choices: protect, prevent, resist. He bit, let go, took a step back and came back harder, as if he were choreographing a chaotic dance whose sole purpose was to make sure Emily wasn't hit. The suspense grew like a rope stretched to the limit. Emily could feel in her bones that the next move could decide everything. Every second the risk increased. At every instant, the aggressor's violence intensified, but it also turned out to be more disorderly. Max, with his quiet courage, turned this disorder to advantage. It wasn't just strength, it was decision. It was instinct transformed into strategy. Loyalty materialized into action. Now I want to go even deeper into this matter, because this struggle for protection was not only physical, but also symbolic. It was the revelation of a hidden truth about what it means to give yourself completely to another being, about the mindset that is built when love and courage meet in the midst of danger. Emily watched it all with tears in her eyes, aware that this was a moment that would redefine her life. Max showed with each attack that the impact of a bond can be greater than any threat, even when the situation seems out of control. He said, "That makes sense to me." The fight between Max and the attacker had reached an untenable point. The air was charged with screams, barking and panting breaths, and the street, which once seemed like a quiet scene of night routine, was now the scene of a raw battle where every move could determine life or death. Emily no longer knew if her body trembled more from fear or from the adrenaline that ran through her like an electric current. The aggressor, wounded, destabilized, and with pride shattered by the dog's resistance, was increasingly erratic. He shouted, threatened, tried to intimidate, but each advance was countered with more ferocity by Max, who, even bleeding and with his paws firmly on the ground, remained as the wall between his owner and the violence that was imposed. Time seemed distorted. Every second was stretched, turned into an eternity. Emily saw details she would never have noticed under normal circumstances. The sweat streaming down her attacker's face, the reflection of the yellow light from the pole on broken pieces on the ground, the movement of Max's quickened breathing that mingled with the sound of barking. It was as if the universe had compressed the entire intensity of life into a single instant, forcing everyone involved to face their own hidden truths, their choices and consequences. It was in this chaos that a new sound added to the scene, the creak of a door being opened, hurried footsteps echoing through the concrete, and a loud voice cutting through the air. A neighbor, attracted by the incessant barking and clashing noise, appeared on the opposite sidewalk. He was holding an improvised piece of wood, perhaps an iron bar, or even something torn from his own yard. The scene he encountered made him pause for a second, absorbing the gravity of the situation. But soon the instinct spoke louder, and he shouted at the offender, drawing attention and at the same time signaling that Emily was no longer alone. The aggressor turned around for an instant, and this moment of distraction was enough for Max to invest again. He jumped against the man's leg, forcing him to let out a groan of pain and lose his balance. The neighbor rushed to the scene, and Emily felt hope born in the midst of despair. It was no longer a silent struggle on a dark street. Now there was a witness, there was intervention, there was a chance that the threat would finally be neutralized. The man, realizing that the situation was slipping out of his hands, tried to use the weapon more aggressively, but the neighbor's approach left him torn. Between keeping up the fight with Max and dealing with the new presence, control slipped through his fingers. Max, even wounded, did not turn an inch. He kept his teeth set, his body arched, every muscle vibrating with effort and courage. Emily screamed, begging him to resist, but at the same time she recognized that the dog had already gone far beyond what anyone could expect. More footsteps echoed down the street. Two young men returning from the market heard the commotion and ran over, one of them already pulling out his cell phone to call the police, while the other picked up stones from the ground, willing to use them if necessary. The scene was beginning to turn into something bigger than just an attack. It was now a rallying point between people who, in the face of brutality, chose to react. The aggressor, surrounded, began to falter. The initial arrogance sustained by the weapon seemed increasingly fragile in the face of the sum of factors that pressured him. The silence that preceded the dropping of a mask seemed to take shape. The criminal, who entered that street believing that he would have absolute dominion, now found himself cornered not only by a wounded dog, but by a set of forces that he had not foreseen. The unexpected courage of an animal, the spontaneous solidarity of strangers, and the transformation of a victim into the protagonist of his own defense. This was the invisible framework of extreme situations, the moment when decisions are shaped not by the coldness of logic, but by the urgency of survival and the strength of what connects us as human beings. Max didn't take his eyes off him. Even with blood running down his face and the side of his body, he remained in a position of attack, as if his own life was tied to the mission of not allowing the criminal to take another step towards his owner. The neighbor finally reached the scene and, without thinking twice, raised the piece of wood against the attacker's arm, which became even more unbalanced, letting out a cry of anger and pain. The gun fell to the ground with a dry thud, and the sound of metal against the asphalt was like a collective sigh of relief. The impact of this detail was not only physical, it was symbolic. The power until then sustained by the threat of the weapon plummeted before everyone. The fall of that object was also the fall of the illusion of control that the aggressor believed he had. Emily felt her heart race in a different way, no longer just from fear, but from the feeling that the tide was finally turning in her favor. Emily couldn't contain herself. Tears streamed down his face as he watched Max stand guard, still growling, still ready to pounce should the man attempt any move. Her heart was broken by the suffering of the dog, but at the same time flooded with pride and gratitude. It was a scene impossible to forget. A wounded animal bleeding, but irreducible in its loyalty, unable to leave the post until it was sure that the threat was neutralized. And at that moment, another factor came into play: the distant sound of sirens. The metallic echo of the vehicles cut through the night, approaching quickly. The blue and red lights soon reflected off the windows of the houses, coloring the street with an almost cinematic hue. The police were not long in coming. When the headlights illuminated the scene and the officers rushed to the scene, the attacker was already contained between the neighbor and the young people, cornered by the collective courage that had formed there. The officers quickly overpowered him, handcuffing him while Max still growled low, as if to ensure that no suspicious gesture would go unnoticed. The criminal, now voiceless, without authority and without the mask of power, seemed a shadow of what he was minutes before. The transformation was clear. From predator he became just another man, broken by the consequence of his choices. The street breathed differently. The fear that once spread like poison now gave way to relief, but also to a strange sense of collective revelation. Emily dropped to her knees beside Max, hugging him carefully, fearing to touch the wounds, but unable not to express how grateful she was. The dog panted, tired, but his eyes remained fixed on the scene, vigilant until the last moment. He did not relax until he saw the aggressor being taken away by the police, and even then he still kept his body rigid, as if he did not accept to leave a gap. And it was there, between tears, panting breaths and racing hearts, that Emily realized the true dimension of what had happened. The transformation was not just in the outcome of the struggle, but in what it had awakened. The quiet courage that generates collective impact, the coping mentality that spreads like a spark, and the revelation that heroism can be born in the most unlikely places. Now I want to go even deeper into this matter, because human intervention, although essential to contain the criminal, was only possible thanks to Max's first act of courage. It was his resistance, the alert that did not give in, that aroused the attention of neighbors and brought other characters to this story. It's a powerful revelation about how individual courage can generate collective impact, about how decisions made in seconds can inspire others to act. Max's confrontational mindset was the trigger that broke the apathy of the street and turned bystanders into allies. This episode shows that heroism is often born in silence, but expands like fire when it finds fertile ground. He said, "That makes sense to me." Emily was still on her knees, hugging Max, when she realized how deep the wounds were on his body. Blood stained his fur at various points, oozing slowly but steadily, as a cruel reminder of every blow and bite he had faced. Her heart broke, but at the same time rose in gratitude. The sensation was paradoxical. The pain of seeing his companion injured, and the almost unbearable pride of knowing that he had placed himself as a true guardian, a living shield, even at the risk of death. The officers, after overpowering the attacker and placing him inside the vehicle, approached Emily. One of them knelt next to her and quickly assessed the state of the animal. "He needs urgent care," he said in a low but firm voice. Tom was the one who knew that, despite the superhuman strength Max had shown, his body was paying the price for that battle. Emily nodded, tears still streaming, and stroked the muzzle of the dog, which panted heavily, but did not stop looking around as if it remained on guard, unable to relax until it was sure that everything was really under control. One of the neighbors ran into the house and brought a thick towel, improvising a way to contain the bleeding. Another, more experienced, said he had taken a first aid course and without hesitation approached. Emily watched intently, her mind in a whirlwind of emotions. The fear of losing Max, the renewed hope for collective care, the transformation of the scene of violence into a space of compassion. Each gesture seemed to carry a symbolic weight. The simple act of pressing the towel against the wounds was more than an emergency measure. It was as if everyone there recognized the courage of the animal and sought to return in the form of care, part of what he had given in the form of protection. The street was filled with reverent silence. There was no more shouting, no more threats, no more chaos. Only the sound of breaths, worried murmurs, and in the background the distant snore of the car that drove away with the handcuffed criminal. The impact of that transformation was visible on the faces. Previously unknown neighbors now looked at each other as accomplices in an unexpected journey. That night's casting had revealed something beyond violence. It had shown how togetherness is born of the improbable, how individual decisions connect in a web of collective meaning. Emily, even in shock, felt safe in a strange way. There was fear, of course, but there was also the certainty that he had survived because Max didn't back down. That hidden truth, that bond that transcends words, was there before everyone. A wounded dog, but unbeatable in loyalty, and an owner who now understood, in a visceral way, how much life is shaped by choices and by gestures that seem small, but that change entire destinies. Soon an ambulance was called. While they waited, neighbors improvised what they could. Water to clean some of the blood, clean cloths, firm hands that held Max's body carefully, so as not to cause even more pain. Emily stroked his head all the time, speaking in whispers, "You will be fine, I promise." And it was curious to think how, in that instant, the promise was not only to Max but also to herself. It was as if to say that from then on nothing would be the same, that her mentality would change, that she would live differently after having faced so closely the fragility and strength intertwined on the same night. Paramedics arrived and immediately took control. Professional care brought instant relief, but also a new kind of tension. Emily took a few steps back, making room, but she couldn't tear the dog's eyes away. The sound of equipment being opened, the snap of Velcro, the metallic click of scissors cutting through the makeshift towel, all this seemed amplified, as if every detail was recorded by her memory with the intensity of a revelation. While the service was being done, one of the paramedics looked at Emily and said, "He's strong, very strong. He endured beyond what most would endure." These words penetrated deep, as confirmation of what everyone already knew but needed to hear. Emily cried once more, now with a mixture of relief and pride. Max was wounded, yes, but alive. And above all, it had fulfilled its mission. Neighbors reached out again, offering support. Some asked if Emily had anyone to stay with. Others offered to accompany her to the veterinary hospital. Solidarity took concrete form, showing that violence had paradoxically generated a space of human connection. It was as if that street would never be the same again, because the backstage of that night had exposed everyone to not only the danger, but also the capacity for transformation in front of him. Emily caressed Max, feeling his breathing stabilize little by little under the medical care. But at the same time, I realized something bigger had happened. The dog, which had always been a routine companion for her, was now a symbol of courage, of real impact, of a hidden truth that only reveals itself in moments of greatest risk, that loyalty can be stronger than survival itself. This moment of rescue was not only physical, it was also symbolic. Emily, who had felt vulnerability in her skin, now experienced an inner transformation. His mentality changed before his eyes. If she had seen Max only as a protector before, she now saw him as a hero, and, at the same time, as a victim who needed to be cared for with the same devotion she had offered. The journey, therefore, did not end there. It just took on a new format with new decisions to be made, new backstage to be faced. When paramedics finally stabilized Max, they placed him on a makeshift stretcher for transport. Emily walked alongside, holding her paw, as if promising never to let go. The lights of the ambulance reflected in her eyes, and she felt that that night had marked a turning point in her life. The revelation was not only in the danger faced, but in the impact that the dog's courage had left on everyone. Each person who witnessed the scene would leave from there different, carrying within them the memory of an animal that chose to fight to the end to protect the one they loved. And while the ambulance slowly drove away, taking with it Max and Emily, the street remained silent. But it was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence charged with meaning, an echo of the transformation they had all witnessed. Now I want to go even deeper into this matter, because rescue and care concern not only the wounded body, but also the transformed soul. It is at this point that we realize how every decision, every gesture, every revelation in extreme situations creates invisible roots that shape the way we move forward. Max's wound was not only his, but also symbolized the collective wound, the pain of all who witnessed the brutality there, and at the same time the chance for healing that is born when courage meets compassion. It is this combination that redefines not only individual stories, but also entire mindsets, capable of turning fear into strength and chaos into learning. He says, "I'm on this journey too." The next day was born with a different air. It was as if the silence of the dawn had been replaced by a hubbub of voices, memories and stories that did not stop being repeated. The news of the previous evening spread quickly among the neighbors, and within a few hours it spread throughout the entire neighborhood. Emily barely had time to process everything that had happened, as she now found herself at the center of a wave of stares, questions, and comments. The attack was no longer just an individual memory, but a collective narrative that began to be told and retold from different angles. And in all these versions, there was one thing in common. Max was the protagonist, the hero who stood up against violence and prevented something worse from happening. The police recorded in their reports the decisive role of the dog. The officers who attended the incident made it clear that without his intervention, the outcome could have been tragic. Emily heard from one of the agents the phrase that echoed in her mind ever since. He not only defended, he saved. These words were more than technical commentary. They carried an authority that reinforced what she already felt deep in her soul. Max had not only reacted on instinct, he had made split-second choices. He had made decisions that might have cost him his life, but that resulted in something greater, the preservation of hers. It didn't take long for neighbors to arrange spontaneous visits to Emily's home. They brought flowers, food, blankets for the dog to rest more comfortably. It was as if each gesture was a way of saying thank you, of giving back some of the courage they witnessed that night. The impact was visible. People who previously barely exchanged words now approached, talked to each other, recognized in the episode a point of unity. That dog had broken through invisible barriers, turning neighbors into allies, strangers into fellow travelers. Local media soon appeared. Cameras, microphones, reporters curious to capture every detail. Emily, still shaken, was reluctant to speak, but she knew the story had already crossed the line of her street. It was as if the backstage of that night had now taken on a bigger stage, and while it scared her, it also brought her a sense of justice. It was important that everyone knew what Max had done. Images of the dog, even with bandages, began to circulate on newsreels and social networks. Words like courage, loyalty, and heroism recurred in headlines and commentary, turning him into a symbol of something that went far beyond a simple foiled attack. Experts have also been called in to weigh in. Veterinarians, handlers, and even animal psychologists gave interviews, stressing that Max's intervention was much more than conditioned reflex. One handler, with years of experience in protection dogs, said on camera, "This animal has demonstrated a guard mentality that goes beyond any training. He wasn't just obeying, he was aware that his decision would make the difference between life and death." This analysis brought a new layer to the story, reinforcing the trigger of authority that gave legitimacy to what everyone had already intuited. Emily's life had been saved by Max. Recognition was not limited to speech. The city hall of the neighborhood considered honoring the dog in a symbolic ceremony, and animal protection groups shared the case as an example of unconditional loyalty. Emily felt torn between pride and humility, proud to see your partner get the attention they deserve, humility for realizing that deep down, all this was the consequence of a silent bond, of a hidden truth that only revealed itself in the face of danger, that the love between human and animal can be transformed into courage, capable of defying one's own death. Max, even in recovery, seemed to feel all this drive. Lying on his makeshift bed, surrounded by affectionate glances, he still maintained his alert posture. His eyes followed his every move, as if he still had the responsibility to watch and protect. Emily, as she stroked his snout, thought of how that animal had taught her more about courage and the essence of life than any book, lecture, or theory could teach. There was the revelation of a journey that was not down to the episode itself, but to the impact it would leave on each of those who witnessed or heard the story. Public recognition, with all its lights and headlines, also raised deep reflections. Emily began to realize that Max's heroism was not limited to a specific night, but was part of a mindset that needed to be remembered, valued, and in some ways imitated. How many times in everyday life do we fail to act out of fear, out of apathy, out of believing that our intervention would make no difference? And yet one dog has shown that even an instinctive decision, made in seconds, can be the spark that transforms fate. The social impact spread in a curious way. People from other neighborhoods began to visit the street, bringing gifts and asking to see the hero dog. Some just wanted to take pictures, others came for inspiration, as if his courage could be conveyed by the simple act of being close. It was almost a ritual, a collective recognition that went beyond the concrete fact and became a symbol. The episode went from being just a police narrative to becoming a living metaphor about loyalty, transformation, and courage. Emily, in the midst of all this, reflected on the backstage of her own life. How many times had you doubted the strength you carried within you? How many times have you wondered if you could face the unexpected? Now, as I looked at Max, I knew the answer was not in words, but in actions. He had shown that the right mindset can turn even the scariest of scenarios into an opportunity to reveal inner strength. That was the hidden truth she would carry forever. And it is precisely at this point that the narrative gains another dimension. Because the recognition of heroism is not only a tribute to a specific animal, but an invitation for each one to rethink their own decisions, their own limits, and the way they face moments of crisis. Max's story no longer belongs just to Emily or the street where the attack took place. It belongs to everyone who believes that courage can be born in the most unlikely places, in the most unexpected creatures, in the most delicate moments. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because when we understand the weight of recognition, we also begin to see the invisible impact it generates. The way stories like this shape mindsets, inspire transformation, and reveal truths that deep down were hidden within us. It is in the details of this recognition that the greatest revelations are hidden, not only about what happened, but about who we can become when we decide to act courageously and loyally in the face of darkness. He said, "That makes sense to me." The silence that came after the whole storm of events seemed to carry more weight than any sound. Emily, still overcome with adrenaline, looked at Max and felt her heart tighten. It wasn't just relief that she was alive. It wasn't just gratitude that she had that protector by her side, who stood between her and danger. It was something bigger, almost impossible to translate into words, the feeling of having witnessed a truth that few can understand in depth. Loyalty, courage, and unconditional love are not abstract concepts. They become palpable when an animal decides to put itself at risk without hesitation, just because it feels that its mission is to protect the one it loves. This moment of reflection was not born of a theory, but of a visceral experience that touched everyone who was present, and that in some way also reached those who heard the story later. The image of Max, even injured, standing firm until the last moment, brought up an issue that goes far beyond the simple act of defense. What drives a living being without human rationality to sacrifice himself for another? This is where we realize that unconditional love breaks down the barriers of logic. It manifests itself as a pure force, capable of inspiring even the most skeptical to believe that there is something greater guiding the invisible bonds that unite us. This revelation is not limited to the bond between Emily and her dog. It reaches all of us because it makes us reflect on the choices we make and the way we react when someone we love needs us. The impact of this type of event has the power to trigger silent transformations. People who have never wondered about the true value of loyalty now find themselves confronted with the scene of an animal that has measured no consequences to fulfill its mission. And this is precisely where the reflection deepens. How many times do we go through life without valuing the constant presence of those who walk beside us? How often do we fail to see the greatness of small attitudes, of silent protection, of companionship that demands nothing in return? Max, in his bravery, exposed a hidden truth. That courage is not measured in size, nor in strength, but in the willingness to put the other above oneself. Emily, in the midst of the whirlwind of feelings, realized that the journey she had lived was not only about survival. It was about inner revelations, about invisible decisions that shape our mindset and prepare us to face the unexpected. The wound opened in her heart by the fright of that night was now beginning to heal through the understanding that she had been saved not just by luck, but by the unconditional love of an animal that never needed words to communicate. This kind of love is a powerful mirror. It shows us who we really are when we allow ourselves to feel, when we let go of cold logic and connect with the essence of life. And when the news spread and experts reinforced Max's heroism, it wasn't just technical validation. It was a collective reminder that stories like this carry a universal message. The headlines highlighted bravery, but between the lines spoke of something deeper, the ability to turn fear into courage, isolation into togetherness, darkness into learning. This journey was not just Emily's, nor was it just Max's. It was all those who were touched by the story. And each person who listened to it received, along with the narrative, an opportunity to reflect on the very bonds they cultivate in their life. The most fascinating thing is that while many saw only the heroic act itself, Emily began to see the emotional behind the scenes that underpinned that moment. Every caress given over the years, every look exchanged in silence, every night Max lay at the foot of the bed just to keep watch. All this built the mindset that exploded into action when danger arose. It was not an isolated gesture, but the result of a journey of love and mutual trust. This shows us that heroes are not formed in the instant of confrontation, but in everyday life, in repeated choices, in invisible details that seem small, but that together build an unbreakable fortress. It is impossible not to think about the transformative impact this generates. When we see an animal sacrifice itself in such a way, we are invited to rethink our own decisions. To what extent are we willing to put ourselves at risk for those we love? What is the measure of our loyalty, our courage, our commitment to the truth that we carry in our hearts? This episode brings powerful revelations. True love is not limited to words or promises. It manifests itself in concrete action, even when the price seems too high. And this reflection touches on an essential point of the human condition: the need for connection. We live in a fast-paced world where we often forget the value of deep relationships. However, when a scene like this unfolds, we are reminded that what really matters is not external achievements, but the journey we share with those who walk alongside us. Emily now knew that every moment by Max's side was part of a larger story, a narrative that spoke of unconditional love and quiet courage. This awareness transformed not only his way of looking at the dog, but his own mentality towards life. Now, I want to go even deeper into this subject, because when analyzing the emotional impact of this experience, we realize that it does not boil down to an isolated case of heroism. It is a universal lesson in how true bonds can guide us through chaos. Loyalty, courage, and unconditional love are forces that not only save lives, but also teach us to live more fully, more consciously, and more connected. This is the revelation that emerges when we stop looking only at the fact itself and begin to see what it represents in our journey as human beings. He says, "I'm on this journey too." The night had revealed much more than a simple episode of contained violence. In the heart of that silent street, between screams, rushes, and tears, was born one of the most intense demonstrations of courage and loyalty that anyone could witness. Max was not just a dog that reacted to a threat. He became a living symbol of unconditional love, a clear example that when life puts us against the wall, there are forces that rise from within us, or next to us, that we never imagined we had. His faithfulness knew no bounds. He did not hesitate in the face of darkness. He did not retreat at gunpoint. And this is something that forces us to reflect. How many times in life do we let fear determine our decisions, while the true force is already present, ready to act? Emily, hugging Max after the confrontation, saw not only her wounded dog, but a hero who had proven that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act in spite of it. And this is a hidden truth that cuts across not only the human-animal bond, but also our own personal journeys. Life constantly puts us in situations where we need to decide: do we retreat or move forward? Should we shut up or stand up? Do we run away or protect what we love? The answer Max gave us is clear and powerful. Loyalty is greater than threat, and love is stronger than any weapon. And when we stop to observe the impact of this, we understand that this is not just an exciting story. It is a reminder that within each of us there is a Max ready to awaken. It can be the courage to stand up to injustice, the determination to protect someone vulnerable, or even the resilience to stand firm when everything around you seems to fall apart. This dog showed us that true transformation is born from seemingly small but purposeful attitudes, and it is precisely at this point that we realize that fidelity and courage are not rare qualities, but choices accessible to all if we are willing to listen to the inner call. What makes this narrative so powerful is that it breaks through the barrier of logic. After all, what makes an animal defy an armed man, risk his own life without thinking of any consequences? The answer lies in unconditional love, that invisible force that moves worlds, that shapes decisions, and that, behind the silent scenes of life, sustains relationships and builds stories capable of marking generations. Emily didn't have to ask. She didn't have to shout orders or promise rewards. Max simply acted because his mindset was already set. Protecting was his mission. And this revelation makes us think about our own missions, about what battles we choose to fight, and about the importance of maintaining integrity even when danger is real. This dog showed us that courage and fidelity have no limits, not even in the face of weapons and real danger. This phrase, which echoes as a natural closure of the journey, is not just a summary of everything that happened, but an invitation to reflection. Heroism needs no cloak, no spotlight, no official titles. It happens when we choose to put the other above ourselves, when we turn instinct into attitude, when we decide that it is worth resisting, even if the price is high. And if this story touched you in any way, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who loves dogs. Because spreading stories like this isn't just about getting content out there, it's about inspiring more people to see the greatness that exists in loyalty, love, and courage. It's about building a network of meaning where everyone who hears this narrative comes to look at their own bonds differently. And maybe, in the moment you need it most, remember that even in the darkest scenarios, there is always a light ready to shine through whoever you choose to protect. Now, I want to go even deeper into this subject, because the real transformation is not only in what Max did that night, but in the impact that this story can generate in every heart that listens to it. What we learn from him is that courage is not restricted to grand gestures. It can be present in daily decisions, in the choices we make in silence, behind the scenes of life, when no one is looking. This is the point where we realize that heroism is not the privilege of the few, but a seed that we all carry within us, waiting only for the right moment to blossom. He said, "That makes sense to me. And if you made it this far, it's because this story really touched you in some way. So it makes perfect sense for you to subscribe to the channel, because this is where I always bring content that has this value, this delivery that makes us reflect and feel." And since you followed it to the end, leave there in the comments the phrase, "I'm with you until the end," just so I know that you walked along with me on this journey. Also enjoy and leave your like, because it is he who shows that our connection is really working. And of course, it doesn't have to stop there. There is a video here on the side that complements this subject. Click and continue with me there.